not only good evening to everyone and welcome to another dinner break series on the standard operating procedure, but I also want to say good morning to those who are joining in the morning time here in the United States as well. Ladies and gentlemen, I think today is a fantastic opportunity to talk about a very critical primary control in biosafety. Now, I'm going to go beyond biosafety and just simply say in safety. In safety or even in biosafety, we write standard operating procedures. Now, the question is, and this is kind of the debate, who do we write standard operating procedures for? Now, although we would like to say that we write standard operating procedures for the individuals doing the work, I fear that the profession or the industry has changed to a certain extent, and that the risk is that we no longer write them for the workforce, we write them for the regulators and for the leaders of the organization. Now, bear with me here. I don't want to lose you. I know that some people can disagree and say, well, that's not true. Let's talk a little bit about the birth of a standard operating procedure. A standard operating procedure should not come out of nowhere. In fact, you should do a hazard identification, and once you've identified all your hazards in your organization, you begin to prioritize those by doing a risk assessment. You determine not only the probability of an event happening, but the actual severity as well. Now, once you've prioritized and you've identified your hazards and assessed them, and you now have a priority list of what you want to focus on, you then begin to strategically manage those risks. Now, those strategic risk management aspects come in with the standard operating procedure. It's kind of where the rubber meets the road, where the scientist interacts with the actual hazard. And if we can do it strategically, if we can actually go through a strategic process, regardless of who's doing the work, regardless of the level of education, the level of experience, regardless of who, if they do it in the strategic way, it'll minimize the risk to what we would consider an acceptable level. Now, that is the quote unquote published or ideal desire of the standard operating procedure, that we have a hazard identification process, we assess the hazard, we assess the risk, we prioritize, we come up with a strategic approach, we hand it to the workforce, and we let the workforce implement it so that risk can be properly mitigated, or at least we find risk to be at an acceptable level. Unfortunately, today, we don't see a lot of usages of standard operating procedures in the lab. Now, I'm speaking generally. There's a lot of people that do follow standard operating procedures, but it scares me a little bit for a variety of reasons. There's 3 reasons why SOPs today make me a little bit nervous. The first thing as a behaviorist that makes me a little nervous is the fact that I've gone to institutions and I've said, how often do you update your SOPs? Now, institutions will come back very quickly and say, we do it on an annual basis. In fact, some of the leading organizations will say on an annual basis. Well, I go a little bit further and I say, well, can you do me a favor and provide me your SOP manuals for the last 10 years? Now, most organizations will say, well, no, we kind of throw them away. I said, well, let's look online then. And when you begin to look online, you see that what the organization has done is basically approved the same SOP over the last 10 years, meaning not one single word has changed on the SOP. It's just simply the date and the signature of the individual. And what that does to me, and why it scares me so much, is that a standard operating procedure to me is not an SOP. It's actually an SOB. We are standardizing behaviors in the lab. And if you're looking at behaviors in the lab and you're going to tell me that you haven't improved a particular behavior over 10 years, it kind of scares me, because as biosafety professionals, you go out and you try to ensure compliance to SOPs, but you've got an SOP that's over 10 years old and hasn't been updated or improved in 10 years. That means that you're actually trying to hold people accountable to a behavior that was developed 10 years ago and not been improved since. And that makes me a little nervous. It also makes me nervous when we have all these policies and procedures in place that obstruct the modification or the updating of SOPs, meaning if we have scientists that can do it in a safe way, but they can do it better and more efficiently, we should be listening to those updates, and we should be able to update and incorporate those updates into our SOPs. And last but not least, I'm going to say this quite a bit. It's kind of my finishing point, so I'll drive the point home a little bit later. We we really in safety should not have a tremendous number of SOPs. SOPs should actually be a very serious term in safety, meaning if you vary your behavior as a result of choosing to do something outside of the SOP, the reality is your overall risk changes drastically. Meaning, I'm not interested in writing SOPs for how to go to the bathroom, or, I don't know, how to take off your jewelry, or I don't, there's so, I've gone to organizations and institutions where SOP manuals are this thick and they write them for almost every little thing. And what that does is produces what we would consider a reverse safety issue. And what I mean by that is that when you compile so many SOPs to an experienced scientist, that's okay, because they have all that time and experience to draw upon what SOP matters, which SOPs matter and which SOPs don't. But the problem that you have is when you take all of those SOPs, you put them in one manual, you're going to then expect somebody with no experience or very little experience to be able to distinguish between the SOPs that matter and the SOPs that really don't. And so you drown out the key, most critical safety procedures, and you compare them or you match them with safety procedures, which quite honestly are SOPs, which quite honestly don't even belong in an SOP manual. But again, why are we doing this? Most SOPs are written today to make the regulators happy and to make the leaders happy. And when you ask a scientist, do you follow all SOPs? Many of these scientists will be open and honest and say, I don't even know all the SOPs, to be honest with you, but I do know where to find them, and I do know what I need to study if there's going to be an audit or inspection. And then beyond that, do you actually do them in the lab? The results are kind of concerning and scary when you begin looking at the specific behaviors. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I do want you to ask questions throughout the presentation. You can do this in the chat box if you wish, and I will try my best to answer all questions at the end of the session today, okay? So basically today I want to discuss the importance of SOPs. I'm going to describe how standard operating procedures control inherent human risk factors. Let me explain a little bit about inherent risk factors. There are what we would call inherent, which is risk factors that exist as a result of working with biological agents. And then we have residual risk, which is the risk that's left over after we put in these specific strategies. I want you to list the 5 items for sustained behavioral practices. And last but not least, describe the SOP evaluation, validation, and verification processes. This is a process that I'm going to give to you that I truly believe if you are interested in making the best SOP, you're going to follow these 3-step processes and it's going to work. Now, I'm going to encourage you to understand something. I don't encourage and I don't want you to follow the SOP evaluation, validation, and verification process for the hundreds or thousands of SOPs you're going to put in your manual. No, I want you to do it for the SOPs that matter the most. Because in all honesty, again, when I'm thinking of safety, and I've been doing safety not as long as everybody on this call, there's a lot of people on this call that's been doing it a long time, but I can tell you this, I can't think of more than 20 protocols in safety for a biological laboratory. Waste management, donning PPE, doffing PPE, entering, spill management, needle sticks, evacuations. I go on, but I have a hard time coming up with over 20 safety protocols. Now, when we get into science, it's a whole different matter. When we get into scientific procedures, that's different. But when we talk about general safety in the lab, how do we manage our waste? How do we autoclave it? How do we work in a biosafety cabinet? All of these things. If you can come up with more than 20 SOPs and all of that aspect, then I want to see a long list of those. Send them to me. I'd love to incorporate them in future presentations. And in fact, I would love to feature you in those presentations and let you do the talking and I get to do the learning from you guys, okay? So why do we need SOPs? Many people know that SOPs are critical. Many people know that you have to have SOPs, again, for regulators and for leadership and for controlling risk, but they don't really understand what the purpose of an SOP is, especially when it comes to human beings. Now, let's look at if we had robots doing this. If we had robots in laboratories or robotic aspects in laboratory environments, we would write a program, and that program would have a code, and that code would produce consistency in how the robot interacts with whatever it is we want it to interact in the environment. Human beings are kind of in the same aspect. The only problem is we're not robotic creatures. We have variations among us, within us, around us, that will really truly don't produce standard behavioral outcomes. They produce what we call varied behavioral outcomes. And so the need for standard operating procedures begins primarily with the fact that we're human beings. And this is the biggest risk that we face today. A lot of people continue to focus on the agent and continue to believe that the agent may be the biggest risk we face in the laboratory environment. I'm telling you again, it's very critical. I'm telling you again that the agent is the most stable thing we're dealing with in the environment. The reality is that when we bring an agent into a particular laboratory, we're usually doing everything we can to control that agent, meaning we grow it, we keep it warm, we give it good food, we keep it in a place. When we want it to go to bed, we put it in a refrigerator. When we want to dispose of it, we autoclave it and retire it. It's a fairly stable life. The people interacting with that agent aren't so stable. They have ups and downs and all arounds. Their immune systems will work. Sometimes they won't work. Sometimes they're dehydrated. Sometimes they're taking medication. Sometimes they're stressed. Sometimes they're happy. Sometimes they're sad. Sometimes they're focused. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they love what they do. Sometimes they hate what they do. The people working with that agent seem to have a lot more flux and a lot more variation than the actual agent does in the environment. Now, if you take those people and multiply not only those people, but the laboratories in the organization. So now you're not just dealing with one person at an organization, you're dealing with hundreds of people at an organization. You're dealing with not just one lab, you're dealing with 20, 30, 40 labs. Now you've got a culture. And how all of those labs and all of those people interact with all of the risks within the organization is going to be your greatest risk that you face today. It's going to be whether or not leadership is engaged, whether or not leadership even cares whether people are following SOPs or not. See, that's the biggest issue. We can write as many SOPs as we want, but if nobody cares, if nobody truly cares whether people are following SOPs or not, those SOPs are just going to sit on a shelf, they're going to collect dust, and the only time people are going to really truly know those SOPs are when they get called by an auditor or inspector. The other day I was driving home, in fact yesterday with my son, and we were driving home and we were playing this situational awareness aspect, and we were on the freeway. And my son, I was saying, did you see that sign? What was on that sign? I was getting him, he was getting me. It was really good. But then my son turned to me and he said, Dad, he said, what's the speed limit on this freeway? I said a number, and to be honest with you, I didn't know what the speed limit was. But I can tell you this, if I saw a police officer, I would look for that speed limit. If I knew that police were going to be on that road, or I had been ticketed before, I would look for so it's not that I would necessarily follow the speed limit, but I sure would know the speed limit if I knew I was going to be held accountable for it. So the reality is that when we look at a culture, standard operating procedures give us a set of rules that an organization follows to stay safe. And you can't have a culture unless you have these expectations, and I'll explain why. Because as human beings, in order for us to have consistency in behavioral practices, we must have consistency in beliefs. Now, how does that happen? This is what, as a behaviorist, I run into all the time. People will say, Sean, we really want a culture of safety. How do we get there? And I'll tell them, look, as a psychologist, I'm going to tell you how to do it. You ready? Get ready. It's not going to be a popular thing. Get ready. You ready? You have to remove choice. And people are going to go, whoa, 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 hold on one sec. Hold on one sec. You mean we have to remove choice to build a culture? And I'm going to, yes, we do. What do you mean we have to remove choice? That means that we have to give people rules and they've got to follow them. And people will say, well, wait, hold on one sec. Isn't that what science is about? It's about innovation. I'm not talking about science. I'm talking about safety. I'm talking about when you choose to do your innovation, rather than doing it any way you want to, rather than painting the walls, you're going to have to actually paint within a particular wall. And you're going to have to actually paint with a certain type of thing. I can't just give you free will and let you do anything you want. because if that was the case, we're going to have all sorts of outcomes that may be unsafe for everybody. So people say, well, okay, let's talk. Let's get a little scientific here. Let's talk a little bit about this from a psychological point of view. Well, people understand and really truly grasp that when they have a choice, they're going to perceive a risk any way they want. Now, this is very, very important for us to understand that in how we typically act in this world when we have choices in life, we're going to perceive a risk, and when we perceive that risk, it's going to affect our overall attitude. Meaning, if we don't see it much as a risk, our overall attitude is, well, that it's there and we're okay with it. If we see it as a risk, is, well, it's there and we're not okay with it. And the reality is that attitude or that desire is going to influence our behavior. Now, here's the deal. The deal is that human beings look at risk completely different. Some people are petrified of a particular risk and others are not. I always like to use the example of parachuting or bungee jumping or heights or snakes or spiders, all of which, by the way, I do not like at all. But some people really like those things. And depending on how I perceive those things, my attitude and my behavior towards those things are going to change. And it's going to have an impact on what I do around those things. Now, the reality is that in laboratory environments, this is not good. And the reason why this is not good is because it produces variable outcomes. Meaning, if I'm afraid of a snake and my colleague is not afraid of a snake, how we behave around that snake is going to be completely different based on our perceptions of those risks. So when we give people a choice in a laboratory environment on how they are behaving, meaning we're not giving them any accountability, we're not checking on them, we know that variable outcomes are going to occur because everybody has different levels of experience and education. And if everybody has different levels of experience and education, how they choose to handle a particular risk is going to be different human to human, okay? Now, here's the big issue. What happens, and this is what people don't like, this is scary because many of us don't even know this about ourselves. What happens when we remove choice? Well, when we remove a choice, all of a sudden, it isn't the perceptions that begin driving the behavior, it's the behavior that begins driving the perceptions. Now, I know I've repeated, and I may repeat myself, and for those of you who've watched my presentations before, I'm sorry that as a behaviorist I have to repeat the same principles over and over and over again, but these principles are absolutely legit and real, meaning it's why we do what we do. If you look in the past, before seatbelts became law in the United States, or before they, even helmets in Pakistan. Just recently, I was there. A helmet became law on mopeds. It's funny for the driver, not necessarily the rider. But the issue is, and I think this is absolutely critical. The issue in understanding what happens when we remove choice is that human beings initially begin to resist. When choice is removed, people get upset. When you tell someone that they have to particularly do a behavior, they get upset. Now, the problem is, well, for how long do they get upset? Well, research indicates typically roughly about 3 months. If you stand your ground, roughly in about 3 months, people will begin to stop resisting. They'll start behaving. They may shrug, they may sigh. By the end of 6 months, it becomes a new habit. By the end of 9 months, it becomes a habit that they don't mind anymore. By the end of a year, it becomes a habit that they'll now, get ready, this is the scary part, they will now defend. Meaning they will say, well, you know what, I've gotten used to this, and actually I think this is a good idea for us to do. Now people go, whoa, this is a psychological concept I'm not familiar with. Well, it is. It's social manipulation. It's how manipulation does occur. When you remove choice, people begin behaving in a consistent fashion, but that's not the be all end all. They also begin believing in the same fashion. Let's look at TSA as an example, the way that people fly today. There was a time before September 11th that, well, we just walked through a metal detector and everything was okay. If that were to happen now in airports around the world, the airline industry would be swamped, meaning it would be crushed. No one would want to fly. They would feel too scared to fly because of, well, not because of the threat, because quite honestly, the threat may not necessarily be there. What is there is that for the last 20 years, everybody getting on a plane has practically been strip searched. And if all of a sudden we stop that behavior, people are going to say, whoa, this is a problem. Even though before it wasn't a problem. It would be a huge problem now because of the expectations people have on a behavior that was, quite honestly, not their choice. All right. It's very, very scary. Again, very, very scary when you take a look at this, but this is what a standard operating procedure does. It doesn't only provide consistent behaviors, it actually provides, and this is very important, consistent beliefs over a period of time. You just have to stay strong and make sure people are following those SOPs. Now, we need consistent behaviors to ensure consistent outcomes. Look, ladies and gentlemen, for some strange reason, we get this in science. If I have an SOP in science and I modify just even a slight aspect of that SOP, the outcomes may not be reproducible. In fact, the outcomes could be hurtful. And we get that in science. If I'm going to try and repeat science, I better follow the SOP that I'm given. If I'm going to do something in Pakistan and it works in Pakistan, it is not considered good science until it works in other places of the world as well, until you can get those repeated results. Well, ladies and gentlemen, safety is the same way. If I can take off a pair of gloves in a certain way and it works in Pakistan, should I not be able to take off the gloves in a certain way and have it work in the United States or anywhere else in the world? The reality is that a good SOP, a good safety protocol, is going to ensure that no matter where you are, as long as you follow that protocol, you're going to get a consistent, safe outcome. And that is huge, because a lot of people in our industry, I can't tell you how many SOPs exist for spill cleanups, or how many SOPs exist for donning and doffing of PPE, putting it on and taking it off, when they have the same PPE, but they write a million different SOPs. It's like there's no common SOP for cleaning up a spill. And by the way, I know we could put our minds together and come up with a gold standard spill cleanup procedure. And I can tell you this, none of them have been published yet. It is not and no offense, I don't mean to offend anybody at our leading public health institutions or our leading regulatory institutions, worldwide, international wide, or even nationwide. You have not come up with the best gold standard SOP in spill cleanup, spill management, waste management, needle stick injuries, IWAT. Listen, we could come up with one common protocol that could potentially serve as a gold standard SOP for safety. But right now, we don't want to do that because people want their choice, and that's okay. And also, now a lot of people will say, well, Sean, that's not true, because every place is a little different. There's variations. Look, I'm not talking about donning PPE and doffing PPE, because I agree with you 100%. But when you look at certain safety conditions that do occur, we could come up with a standard that gives people something to aim for. Meaning, if there are the best resources, these are the resources you should go after, and this is what should be included in your spill kit. Because I am really exhausted worldwide, including many places in the United States, where I go into a lab and they say they have a spill kit and it's a chem spill kit. There is nothing in that kit that works with biological spills. So they don't have a spill kit, they have a chemical spill kit. And if they try to use that for a biological spill, it could get a lot worse, okay? So again, in order for us to have consistent outcomes, we need to have consistent behaviors. And this is the biggest issue we run into. The fact that we're not robots, the fact that we are free thinking individuals that have our own experiences and our own ideas, and there's variations in environments and variations in all sorts of things. So what is it about being human that causes us to really require and need standard operating procedures? Well, the first is this concept called unconscious incompetence. And this is one of those things that many of you, I see a lot of familiar faces on here, many of you understand exactly what unconscious incompetence is, and that is individuals who truly believe they know something, and again, you have to understand this concept. It's not individuals who truly believe they know something, but they don't. No, it's truly people who believe they know something that they really, truly don't know they don't know. And one of those things that really drives me crazy, as many of you know, is glove removal aspects or donning and doffing of PPE. People actually believe that just because I have the best PPE and I work for a big institution, I'm protected by infectious diseases. We know that's a crock of crap. We know that's not true. We know that today, regardless of whether you're working with a small agent, it doesn't mean that tomorrow you're going to be working with a small agent. And just because you're at a public health laboratory today and you're working with endemic things like maybe influenza or TB, doesn't mean tomorrow you're not going to be working with the next big emerging infectious disease that's killing 30% of the world. You better start acting today as though tomorrow is coming, and use your time now to prepare for something that could come. Because if you're going to require safety lessons and behavioral lessons when the big one hits, and I'm hoping it doesn't, but if it does, if you're going to require those lessons when the big one hits, you're going to be waiting for quite some time before somebody can come out and see you and train you on how to do what you need to do. So start now, all right? And realize, like, approach safety as though you may not know everything. Approach safety as maybe there is something to learn, rather than approaching it as though I already know everything, because the problem with unconscious incompetence is you think you can swim until you jump in a pool, and then while you're swimming in a pool, you learn you can't swim and you drown. So approach safety from a perspective of there's always something to learn. Now let me explain. Let me give you a great example of someone who is I think a beautiful example of this. This is somebody who really is, in my opinion, an example of a leader. And what do I mean by that? Because he leads by example. Bob Hawley, Dr. Bob Hawley, who just won the highest award at APSA for biosafety, highest award. He's on this call. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Bob Hawley knows way more about biosafety than I'll ever know. Not only does he know way more, he does it more than I ever know, but yet in him, there is an opportunity to learn something, to witness something, to pick up something, to polish something. He's a lifelong learner. His mentality is, I don't know it all, I never will know it all, and there's always a benefit in listening and learning something. And that is an example. That is an example of a leader. And it makes me nervous. I mean, Bob Hawley's on my call. This makes me, he's a legend here. This makes me nervous. But the reality, again, is he's leading by example. He's leading by example. And so don't approach safety as though you've got it. You know everything. Because I can't tell you, every day, a new reading, something comes in, and it's like, wow, it just blew me away. There's something I need to know. Perceived mastery is different than unconscious incompetence. Unconscious incompetence is, I can do this, and not knowing that you can't. Perceived mastery is different in the sense that you don't have the experience yet to understand what it is you know and what it is you don't. For example, our child is 16 years old, learning to drive right now, and has been doing very well driving, but believes that now he's a good driver, I've got it. Now, it's hard for a human being to convey experience to another human being. And what do I mean by that? It's very hard for me as an older, wiser driver to convey to my 16-year-old that, you know what, maybe you don't have it. Have you thought about environmental issues like rain and snow? Have you thought about how others around you are going to drive and make mistakes, and you're going to have the creativity to solve those in a very short period of time with no experience to draw upon? It's very difficult to teach somebody who thinks that they are prepared to respond to something out of the ordinary. That's just perceived mastery, meaning you don't have the time and experience to be creative in solving problems. And that's why we do situational training. That's why we do simulation training. Is I love putting people in the position where they have to be creative. Because in a lifetime of biosafety, or even as a scientist, you may only run into 2 or 3 emergencies that really have a profound impact on your life or the life of other people. And so how do you prepare somebody for a 2 or 3 frequency event in a 30 to 40 year career? That's very difficult. Well, simulate it in a safer environment. Get those creative problem solving juices flowing. But the point is that you can attack perceived mastery in situational training or simulation-based training, and I would strongly recommend doing that as well. SOPs control for these human risk factors, by the way, because if you're unconsciously incompetent or perceived mastery, you're the ones rolling your eyes when an SOP comes out. I gotta use an SOP to remove my gloves. I've been removing gloves forever. If you're saying stuff like that, I'm gonna bet you're unconsciously incompetent or you have perceived mastery issues, because I would love to come and see you, and I would love to coat your gloves with Glow Germ, and I would very much love to see how you remove those gloves to keep your hands clean and safe. Because people will say, well, I don't really care, Sean, because I can wash my gloves. Well, take a look at your fingers, take a look at your cuticles, and take a look at how you inoculate yourself while removing gloves. If you think washing your hands is going to be quick enough after you've pushed stuff from your gloves into your fingers, it could have a problem. And this is a big issue as well. Why, if everybody knows how to remove their PPE, do we continue to have laboratory acquired infections that are tied to no known exposures? This is a big issue and a big question as well. I think it's these top two aspects. SOPs control for those. Increases in experience and changes in risk perception. Bad news, ladies and gentlemen. As human beings, the more experience you have with a risk, the less respect you have for it. You can't fight that. If you are a gun owner or you drive motorcycles or whatever risk it is that you're going to encounter, the more and more you come around that risk, the less attention to detail you begin to focus on. And that's, again, another reason for a standard operating procedure, because you and your risk perceptions are going to change as you mature and become better and better at what you do. SOPs will control for your, well, let's just be honest, maybe your arrogance or your belief that maybe you're comfortable now and you've got this risk down. This is true. This is what SOPs will do. It doesn't matter what you think and feel about the risk. You're going to be asked to do something in the same way as someone who is scared of the risk. You're going to be asked to do it in the same way, regardless of your perceptions of that overall risk. It's behavior first. Differences in education and experience. It protects everyone equally. Ladies and gentlemen, there are people that come in the lab that are lab techs. I can't believe this. Students that come in the lab, cleaners that come in the lab. Now, why would a PI or a very experienced scientist have more value assigned to their life than these individuals that don't have an education or the experience? No, SOPs are for everyone, whether you're the top of the game or the bottom of the game. It makes sure that safety is equal, that it's an equality issue, that everyone is equally protected in the actual laboratory, everyone, okay? That's what an SOP does. And last but not least is SOPs quantify risk and implement a risk management process based on scientific and strategic processes. This is another aspect. SOPs are strategic. They're not random. They're not just throwing a recipe together. They're strategic based on a risk assessment, on a hazard identification process. And they also, in my opinion, should be tested, verified, and validated to make sure there's a consistency in the overall result and that it works, okay? Now, when we ask someone to behave, when we say to them, listen, you need to follow a standard operating procedure, as leaders, you're going to have to do a couple things. The first thing you're going to have to do to people is you're going to have to explain what the risk is. Why do we need an SOP? Well, for donning and doffing of PPE, let's just take that as an example. We could do doffing of PPE. For doffing of PPE, the only time, if you have good personal protective equipment and it remains intact, the only time you will have a risk of encountering a direct contact with the agent you're working with will be in removing your PPE. That will be the only, if your PPE remains intact, the only time any agent could potentially come in contact with you will be when you remove your PPE. Your benefit is, let's make sure when we remove our PPE, two benefits, this is the benefit of PPE, that we leave what we're working with in the lab, and there's no opportunity for the agent to come into our body, meaning there's no way that these agents are going to come through any portals of entry, hence the purpose of PPE. Now, in order for me to get good compliance with doffing of PPE, I got to provide resources. What do I mean? I'm not talking about PPE. I'm talking about I've got to provide space. I've got to provide maybe, you know, the disinfectants or the hand sanitizers or the biological waste bins. I've got to make sure that those are going to complement the SOP rather than become a barrier to it. I can't just give somebody a plan, talk about risk and benefit, and not give them the resources to follow it. I also have to give them the skills. believe it or not, there are skills in how we remove PPE, how we take off our gloves, how we take off our Tyvek suits, how you take off your lab coats, how you take off your booties. Ladies and gentlemen, if you think it's just a random way, you're just going to randomly take off your PPE without thinking about processes for doing it, I would argue that you may not be looking as close to PPE as you should in how you remove it. So you've got to give people skills, and you've got to give them time to practice. They've got to be able to believe in their skills, that their skills actually make a difference, and that they have time to practice and believe that they can be safe. I would never let anyone work in a lab until they feel that they can be safe. If someone says, Sean, I just don't feel comfortable yet, they should not be in the lab. You wait until they say, I believe I can do this. And once they say, I believe I can do this, you put them in a situation, and then you let them show you they can do it until they feel comfortable enough to be able to. Now, a critical aspect of SOP comes with compliance and accountability. Now, I've already talked about this, and I'll talk about this a lot more, I'm sure, in presentations, because I'm really trying to push this. I don't mean to harp on leaders today, but I do. I'm sorry. I really have to tell you, I think we have a pandemic situation going on here in absentee leadership. And let me explain a little bit about it. I always say that leaders care. Let me explain what leaders do. Leaders don't have an issue with these first two steps, okay? And what do I mean by that? What's the difference between a parent and a parent and an effective parent? And what's the difference between a leader and an effective leader? It comes with this acronym right here. A leader has no problem providing resources, okay? That's what leaders do. A parent provides resources to their family. A parent provides resources to their children. A coach provides resources to their team. A leader provides resources to the scientist. When they provide those resources, a leader also provides expectations, okay? So I'm giving you these resources, but I'm also setting expectations. So as a parent, if I'm giving you food, I'm going to expect you to have manners. I don't want you eating like a dog. If I'm a coach, I'm giving you resources, I'm going to have expectations. You're going to use these resources, okay? The problem that we have today in leadership is not with provisions of expectations and resources. The problem we have today in leadership is with compliance and accountability. Now, what does that mean? It means, where are the leaders when it comes time to determine whether or not people are on board and whether or not people are successful? This is the biggest issue that we run into today. It's, like I say, it's a pandemic of absentee leadership. Let's first talk about compliance. Compliance is not whether or not someone does something. Compliance is whether or not someone is willing to do something. Now, you have to understand what I mean by that. If someone comes to a lab and says, you know what, I don't really like these SOPs, so I'm not following them, that person should never be allowed in the lab. That person is basically saying, I know you've got rules here, but really, to be honest with you, I know better than you do as in the organization, so I'm just going to do what I want to do when I want to do it. If you have that kind of attitude with someone who's working at your lab, I'm going to give you some advice. Don't let them in your lab. Go let them do something else. Just don't let them in the laboratory environment. Compliance is, are you on board with the organization or are you not? If you're on board with the organization, it means you're going to actually try to follow the SOPs that are in place. You're not going to buck them. You're not going to just say, I don't care about them. You're not going to just do your own thing. It means you're actually on board. You actually believe SOPs are for the betterment of the organization and the collective group. You may not like them. You may not agree with them. Heck, I hate the concept of removing my shoes every time I come in the house. I don't like that rule, but I do it because the whole house, it makes the house better, it makes it safer, it makes my wife happier, and my life easier, to be honest with you. So the reality is compliance is you're on the same page. Accountability now is different, because where leaders go wrong on accountability is when you have accountability, there's what we call positive accountability and there's negative accountability. Positive accountability is giving feedback to the workforce or employees and saying, you've done exactly what I'm expecting, good job, keep going. And negative is, and get this, now this is important. You have to hear what I'm saying. This is frustrating. This is hard. A leader has to be skilled in this aspect, because when someone is trying their best and they're falling short of your expectations. What you say and how you say it is going to be a determining factor in their future success and engagement and safety within the organization. Do you hear this? It was the most important statement I'm making right now, most important in this presentation. When a leader is going to deal with someone who's trying their best, they're trying, and they're not quite up to expectation, how a leader chooses to address that issue, what they say and how they say it, is going to determine the future of that individual, whether they choose to engage or they just give up because they feel they can't do it. The reality is that today, I again believe, my theory is that we are running into a state of a pandemic situation where leaders are absent. They're absent. They're not they're not looking at whether people are complying. They're not even holding people accountable. They're simply giving resources, setting expectations, and then taking a step back until something goes wrong. And then when that goes wrong, they point the finger, not at themselves, but at the people that were asked to do something that didn't necessarily do what was expected of them. Okay, compliance, I'm trying versus I'm not trying, whereas accountability is I'm doing what is expected versus I'm not quite doing what is expected. Okay, and leaders got to be able to give positive and negative accountability aspects. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about today is evaluation, validation, and verification aspects. Now, this is the very last thing. I think it's absolutely critical. I want to remind you that I'm not calling for you to do this with the hundreds or thousands of SOPs you have, because I think it would be quite ridiculous. But if you are actually going to believe that you're going to be able to put words on paper and you're going to be able to get different people with different levels of education and different levels of perception and words to follow an SOP and produce consistent behavioral outcomes solely with the SOP, I've got news for you. That's going to be extremely tough. Not impossible, but very tough. Let me explain this three-step process here. If you've got a standard operating procedure, the very first thing that I would do is I would evaluate it as the author. Now, what does that mean? First and foremost, you must realize that everybody within your organization may not speak the language the SOP is written in. For example, in Pakistan, people may not speak English. They may not speak Urdu. They may not speak Punjab. They may not speak Sindh. They may not speak, there's all sorts of languages. When you write an SOP in a particular language and assume that people can read that language, you may be making a big mistake. If someone can't read an SOP, they certainly can't follow it. So you're going to have to make sure the language is appropriate. The second thing I want you to do, please, unless Allah or God or the prophets come down and give you the SOP, please do me a favor. Don't believe in it. Please. Don't believe in an SOP because it says WHO or CDC or NIH or Canadian government or it doesn't matter. Listen, test the SOP. Please do that. Please, 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 I'm begging you. Do not believe in an SOP unless it's been tested by you. Test the SOP. Make sure it works. Make sure it's effective in what it's supposed to do before you start asking people to do it. Okay? It is unethical to produce an SOP, in my opinion, that increases risk rather than reduces it. Be very careful. When you start giving prescribed safety plans to people and you're giving plans that increase risk rather than decrease it, that is a huge ethical issue. So be careful with that. Make sure that when you release an SOP, it is truly working and reducing risk. Okay, last but not least on evaluation is capability. Listen, don't ask people to do things they simply can't do. You have to make sure that when you write an SOP, it is physically possible. Now, once you've done those three things, you're not out of the woods. Let me give you a classic example. If I were to have you take a piece of paper and fold it in half and do what I typically do, many of you have seen this exercise, I would have you do that. I would have you close your eyes, fold the piece of paper in half 3 times, tear the upper right-hand corner, and you'd all come up with different answers. The holes would be in different places of the paper. Well, that means that an SOP must be more than just evaluated, meaning it's more than just can you understand the language and is it physically possible and does the plan actually work? The next thing you've got to do is have internal and external validation. Now, this goes to science. Internal validation controls for systematic error. That's systematic error with the SOP. And external validation goes with what we call generalizability, meaning if you have if your SOP is not externally valid, it may work in one place, but it won't work in other places. You have to have an externally valid and an internally valid SOP so that you could have it not only work at other places, but you also are fixing any systemic errors with the internal validity or with the SOP in of itself. So meaning when you read an SOP or when you're reading an SOP, people can interpret words very differently. Your goal is to make sure that with internal validation, what the person reads and does is exactly what the author intends. That's internal validity. What the person reads and does is exactly the behavior the author intends. External validity is at the end of the actual SOP, the behaviors that you wanted have produced the outcome that the author wants. So at the end, the author has achieved the outcome based on the collective behaviors or the individual steps of the SOP. That is internal and external validity. Now, once that's done, the SOP is published. You then give it to the workforce, and before I would ever allow a workforce member to actually work, I would simply ask them to list the steps of the SOP. That's cognitive verification, and I would have them demonstrate the SOP. That's behavioral verification. That is the way that you know that people know and that they're able to do what it is you're expecting to do. And next time you want to look at this, just ask somebody how they would clean up a spill, how they would handle a needle stick, how they don and doff, and then ask them how they brush their teeth. You should have the same amount of certainty with the two things, especially if they're doing everything the same. You know, you're brushing your teeth twice a day or at least once a day, I'm hoping. When you don or doff PPE, sometimes you do it multiple times. So your answers in brushing teeth and donning and doffing PPE should be fairly similar and with great ease. And if you're working at the same institution in the same lab, the answers of individuals should match. If they don't match, then you have a VOP, a varied operating procedure, versus an SOP, a standard operating procedure. Now, how many SOPs should you have? Well, like I said, I am a big believer in vaccines. This is my vaccine plug. Vaccines are critical. I'm living in a county right now in Georgia where we have a measles outbreak here in Georgia. Look, I am a big believer in vaccinations, a huge believer in vaccinations. SOPs are the gold standard, in my opinion, of biosafety. It's how we standardize behavior based on a risk assessment and a hazard identification. It's how we interact with the equipment in the lab. It's how we interact with the agent in the lab. It's how we control for human risk factors. SOPs, in my opinion, are the gold standard aspects of biosafety. That's my opinion. However, when we begin taking the concept of SOPs and diluting it with crap like SOP on how to not chew gum, SOP on not eating food, these are policies, these are guidelines. When we say the word SOP, it should mean something. It should have merit to it. A scientist should look at it and go, whoa, whoa, whoa. A policy and a guideline is one thing, but an SOP, that is the gold standard of my safety in this lab. I cannot break that SOP. I can do all sorts of other things with policies and guidelines, but I cannot break how I'm supposed to don and doff or how I'm supposed to respond to a certain thing. I can if unexpected events occur, meaning I have an emergency evacuation, but the reality is that an SOP is actually special and sacred in safety. It isn't something that's 200 to 300 pages long with multiple aspects of SOPs that vary in overall risk. And what do I mean by that? If I don't follow this SOP, is it going to put my life in jeopardy? And the answer, if the answer is no, it's not even going to put your health in jeopardy, then it isn't an SOP. If your statement is, if I don't follow this SOP, will it put my life or health in jeopardy? And if the answer is, it absolutely will. For certain, at a high degree, that right there is the need and the reason for a standard operating procedure. So again, in closing, SOPs control for human risk factors, several of them. We talked about that: unconscious incompetence, perceived mastery, the inequality of education and experience in the laboratory. It ensures consistency among different people and different levels of education and perceptions and experience levels. We also know that a plan alone will not produce behavior, that you're going to need several things. You need 5 things. You need to understand the risk, the benefit. You need to have access to the resources, the skills, and believe you can actually do it. I'm asking that you do not drown important safety messages with too many SOPs. Please don't do that. That's a reverse safety issue. Make sure your SOPs are front and center. Make sure your scientists are trained on your safety protocols all the time, every year, multiple times a year, and have fun doing it. Do simulation-based training and have fun doing it. And no matter what, before you release an SOP, always evaluate, validate, and verify those SOPs. Always do that. Otherwise, people can get hurt, and your SOPs, which you think are minimizing risk, could actually be increasing risk, which would be a big and tragic problem, especially if you are a safety professional. Okay? Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's all I have today. It looks like I've got about 9 minutes for questions. I will take those through the chat box, but I'm going to sign off right now because I'm going to make this a video. Remember, we have a YouTube channel, a PEPSA YouTube channel where these videos are posted. Please make sure you subscribe to that YouTube channel. You will see your colleagues. We have over 100 videos that will be there by January 2020. So please make sure that you take a look at that and have a chance to visit that. And in the meantime, take care of yourselves and your families. Blessings to you and to everyone. And until I see you online again, inshallah, soon, Allah Hafiz to everyone.